That morning, Dante Romanio moved through the terminal like a ghost in a tailored suit, a man whose presence was felt only by those he allowed to see him. He expected the usual friction of travel, the hum of engines, the mindless rush of strangers, the white noise of a world he generally held in contempt. Instead, his gaze was arrested by a 22-year-old woman sitting just inches away, her life seemingly reduced to the frantic rhythm of her own heartbeat. Dante didn't believe in luck, and he certainly didn't believe in accidents. He believed in the cold mathematics of human behavior and the jagged edges of a story that didn't add up. At 36, he had ascended to the head of the Romanio Empire by reading the threats other men missed, identifying the precise moment a truce turned into a trap. He saw the world in high-definition details that most people ignored in their rush to be anywhere else. The terminal was a symphony of mundane chaos, parents chasing toddlers, executives barking into headsets, and travelers lost in their screens. Dante moved through it like a blade through water. His dark suit was understated, his movements calculated, his expression a mask of bored detachment. To the casual observer, he was an elite businessman or perhaps a high-level consultant. They didn't see the faint facial scar that told a story of survival, or the intricate ink of a neck tattoo disappearing beneath his collar, marks of a man who dealt in the currency of shadows. He had been in Chicago for 2 days, concluding a merger that required his specific brand of intimidation, a deal where a handshake was a blood oath and failure was not an option. Now, he was returning to the city that belonged to him, sitting in the lounge with a laptop open, but his mind focused on the room. That was when he processed the girl. Cassandra. She was early 20s, swallowed by a black hoodie that seemed designed to hide her from the world. A rigid white neck brace stood in stark contrast to the dark fabric, and a fresh purple bruise bloomed across her cheek like a dark flower. Beside her sat a man named Bobby, dressed in an approachable sweater and jeans, the image of a concerned partner. He was focused on his own phone, exuding the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he was completely invisible. Dante watched the girl's hands. They were white-knuckled as she gripped a gray backpack, her knuckles raw. She didn't look at the man beside her. She looked through the floor. When Bobby shifted, she didn't just move, she braced. It was the mechanical flinch of the hunted. Then, with a subtlety that would have escaped anyone else, she raised 2 fingers to her temple in the shape of a gun. It was a silent, devastating signal, a plea for an end, or perhaps a plea for a miracle. No one else noticed the flicker of her hand, but Dante's world narrowed to that single gesture. In that instant, he didn't see a stranger. He saw a debt he still owed to the past, and he knew that the man sitting beside her was the most dangerous kind of monster, the one who looks perfectly normal. Hey family, before this story begins, I want you to do something real quick. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your comments fuel these stories. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Dante sat in the terminal lounge, his laptop screen displaying a waterfall of encrypted logistics and shipping manifests, but his mind was elsewhere. He existed in the quiet space between the visible world and the truth. To the people rushing past, he was an enigma in charcoal wool, a man who looked like he owned the air he breathed. They saw the expensive watch and the sharp lines of his suit, but they didn't see the way his eyes never stopped moving. He scanned the reflections in the glass, the tension in a passing traveler's shoulders, and the way security guards instinctively straightened when he walked by. Dante Romanio was a student of shadows, and he had been his entire life. Growing up in the Romanio family meant learning that safety was an illusion. His father had taught him that the world was divided into those who watched and those who were watched. Dante had chosen to be the observer. His life was built on a foundation of cold, hard data and the ability to predict a man's next move before his muscles even twitched. This detachment was his greatest weapon. It allowed him to make decisions that would make lesser men tremble. He had ordered hits with the same clinical indifference he used to order an espresso. He was a man who lived in the after, always thinking 10 steps ahead, calculating the collateral damage of every breath. But as he sat there, ostensibly working on a merger that would solidify his control over the eastern seaboard, his focus kept drifting back to the girl 3 rows away. It was a glitch in his usual programming. Usually, the suffering of others was just noise, a byproduct of a harsh world that he had no interest in fixing. Yet, there was something about the way she clutched that backpack, her knuckles white and raw, that felt like a splinter in his mind. He remembered a time, nearly a decade ago, when he had ignored a similar set of signs. He had been younger then, hungry for power, and he had looked away from a woman who had needed him to see her. She had ended up as a headline in the back pages of a Sunday paper. That failure was the only thing that kept him human, a ghost of a conscience that usually stayed silent beneath the weight of his empire. Beside him, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Bacardi, his most trusted enforcer, confirming the car was waiting outside. Dante looked at the screen, then back at the girl. He could leave. He could walk out of this terminal, get into his armored sedan, and forget she ever existed. That was the logical move. That was the move of the dawn. But as he watched the man beside her, Bobby, reach out and tap her neck brace with a proprietary, mocking flick of his finger, Dante felt a familiar, cold fire ignite in his chest. The shadows were calling, but for the first time in years, they weren't calling for blood. They were calling for justice. Dante shifted his gaze slightly, looking past the glow of his monitor to dissect the scene 3 rows away. He didn't look with sympathy. Sympathy was a luxury he had burned away years ago, but with the cold, diagnostic precision of a jeweler looking for a flaw in a stone. The girl, Cassandra, was a study in forced stillness. The black hoodie she wore was oversized, yet it couldn't hide the rigid, unnatural posture forced upon her by the white cervical brace. It was a cage of plastic and foam, designed to heal a broken neck, but Dante saw it for what it truly was, a leash. Her eyes were the most telling detail. They weren't darting around looking for an exit. They were hollow, fixed on a point on the floor, as if she were trying to disappear into the very tiles. When a group of laughing teenagers walked past, she didn't flinch. She simply retracted further into herself, her shoulders pulling inward in a defensive reflex that had clearly been conditioned over time. Dante noticed the purple-yellow smudge of a bruise on her left cheekbone, partially masked by a layer of concealer that was a shade too pale for her skin. It was an older mark, fading, but the way she held her jaw suggested the pain was still fresh in her memory. Beside her, Bobby was the picture of suburban boredom. He scrolled through his phone with a relaxed thumb, his posture open and inviting. He was the perfect camouflage. But Dante watched his hand, the one resting on the armrest between them. It wasn't resting. It was hovering a hair's breadth from her forearm. Every few minutes, he would lean in, whispering something into her ear. To anyone else, it looked like a boyfriend sharing a private joke or a word of comfort. To Dante, it looked like a handler checking the perimeter. Whenever Bobby spoke, Cassandra's hand would tighten around the straps of her gray backpack. Her knuckles were raw, the skin broken and red, a sign of someone who spent their nights picking at themselves in the dark. She was 22, in the prime of her youth, yet she moved with the heavy, calculated caution of a woman 3 times her age. She was waiting for a permission she didn't have, or a blow she knew was coming. The man reached out then, his fingers brushing the edge of her neck brace in a gesture that looked like a gentle adjustment to a passerby. But Dante saw the way his grip tightened for a fraction of a second, the way his knuckles went white as he wordlessly reminded her who owned the air in her lungs. Cassandra didn't breathe. She didn't blink. She simply sat there, a ghost in a black hoodie, waiting for the world to end or for the flight to be called. Dante felt the familiar weight of his own power pressing against his chest. He knew the Predator's playbook by heart, and he knew that if he didn't act, This girl was heading toward a silence she would never return from. The boarding process was a slow, agonizing crawl through a narrow tube of pressurized air. Dante stayed several paces behind, watching the back of Bobby's head and the slight, rhythmic tremor in Cassandra's shoulders. Inside the aircraft, the cabin felt smaller, the recycled air thinner, and the proximity to the girl's silent terror more acute. Dante found his seat in the first-class cabin, but his focus remained anchored on the economy curtain where Cassandra and her captor had disappeared. He didn't need to see them to know the dynamic. He waited until the fastened seatbelt sign flickered off and the hum of the engine stabilized into a dull roar at 30,000 feet. Then he rose. He moved with a purpose that looked casual to the flight attendants, but was predatory to anyone who knew what to look for. He found them near the rear of the plane. Bobby was leafing through an in-flight magazine, his elbow staked firmly on the armrest, pinning Cassandra into the window seat. She was a statue of grief, her forehead pressed against the cold plastic of the window, staring out into a void of white clouds. Dante stopped in the aisle, feigning a search for a restroom that was clearly occupied. Bobby looked up, his expression shifting into that practiced, helpful mask. "Excuse me," Dante said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and strike the nerves. He didn't look at Bobby. He looked directly at the girl. Cassandra turned her head slowly, the plastic of her neck brace creaking against the fabric of her hoodie. Her eyes met Dante's, and for a split second, the veil of her dissociation tore open. Dante leaned in, ostensibly to steady himself against the seatback as a bit of turbulence rattled the cabin. In that moment of manufactured closeness, his hand brushed the top of her seat, inches from her trembling fingers. "The view is better when you aren't looking for an ending," Dante whispered, his voice so quiet it was nearly lost to the roar of the turbines. Bobby's eyes narrowed, his trustworthy facade slipping just enough to show the jagged teeth of his temper. "Is there a problem?" the man asked, his voice tightening. Dante finally turned his gaze to Bobby, a look so cold it felt like a physical weight in the cramped aisle. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply held the man's eyes until Bobby was the first to blink, the first to look away. Dante straightened his suit jacket and walked back toward the front of the plane. He had confirmed two things. The girl was still looking for a way out, and the man was beginning to realize he was no longer the only predator in the sky. Back in the solitude of the first-class cabin, Dante stared out at the sprawling carpet of clouds, but he didn't see the horizon. Instead, he saw a ghost. Her name had been Elena, a woman who had worked in one of the Romanio family's logistics hubs nearly a decade ago. At the time, Dante was a rising lieutenant, obsessed with efficiency and the cold acquisition of territory. He remembered the way she had looked at him during a routine inspection, the same hollow-eyed stare he had just seen in Cassandra. Elena had been bruised, her movements stiff and mechanical, yet Dante had brushed it off as a personal matter beneath his pay grade. He had seen the warning signs, the way she flinched when the warehouse manager approached, the way her hands trembled as she signed the manifests. But in his youth, Dante believed that Adon only concerned himself with the mechanics of the machine, not the individual gears. He had valued protocol over intuition and convenience over conscience. 3 days after that inspection, Elena was found in a shallow ravine outside the city. Her husband, a man with a trustworthy smile and a clean record, had finally finished what he started. The memory was a cold weight in his chest, a rare crack in his armor of detachment. He had spent years telling himself that her death wasn't his fault, that he wasn't a social worker, he was a soldier. But as he matured into the head of the family, he realized that true power wasn't just about who you could kill, it was about who you chose to protect. Elena's face had become the silent juror in the courtroom of his mind, a constant reminder of the price of looking away. Now, sitting in the hum of the aircraft, the parallels were too sharp to ignore. Cassandra was the second chance he didn't deserve. The finger gun to her temple wasn't just a signal of distress. It was a mirror reflecting his oldest failure. He pulled out his phone, the screen casting a pale blue glow over his scarred features. He didn't need a miracle to save her. He had an empire built on information and the ability to move through the world unseen. He typed a single, encrypted message to Bacardi. I need a full profile on a passenger. Gate 14, Chicago. Traveling with a 22-year-old female in a neck brace. I want his history, his properties, and every shadow he thinks he's hidden in. We land in New York in 2 hours. Be ready. As he hit send, Dante felt the ghost of Elena finally recede into the darkness. He wasn't going to look away this time. This time, the predator was going to learn what it felt like to be hunted. The wheels of the Romanio machine began to turn long before the plane's tires touched the tarmac at JFK. By the time Dante stepped off the jet, his phone vibrated with a secure file transfer. Bacardi was already waiting in the shadows of the arrivals terminal, leaning against a blacked-out SUV, his eyes scanning the crowd with the predatory focus that made him Dante's most effective shadow. He didn't need instructions. He simply nodded, and as Dante climbed into the back seat, the hunt began in earnest. While the city of New York hummed with its indifferent late-afternoon energy, Bacardi's team began the digital dissection of the man Dante had identified as Bobby. Within minutes, the trustworthy facade was being stripped away in layers of code and data. They pulled the manifest from Gate 14, cross-referencing credit card signatures with facial recognition from airport cameras. Bobby wasn't just a traveler. He was a ghost who had spent years perfecting the art of being seen without being noticed. His name is Robert Vance, Bacardi said, his voice a low rumble over the hum of the engine as they trailed a silver sedan through the winding exits of the airport. He changes his residence every 6 months. No social media, no permanent employment. He's a professional drifter who targets women with no local family. He finds them at their lowest point, and then he makes sure they stay there. As they moved through the darkening streets of Queens, Bacardi's digital tail showed a pattern of high-interest loans and leases on secluded properties, places where screams were swallowed by the city's roar. Dante watched the silver sedan 3 cars ahead, feeling the cold weight of the evidence piling up. They weren't just following a car, they were tracking a predator returning to his lair. Every red light was a strategic pause, every turn a calculated move in a game Bobby didn't even know he was playing. Bacardi's laptop glowed with real-time updates, a history of sealed police reports in 3 different states, all involving domestic disturbances, where the victims eventually refused to testify. The stakes weren't just physical anymore, they were existential. Dante realized that if they didn't intervene tonight, Cassandra would become another sealed file, another woman whose story ended in a shallow grave or a locked room. The silver sedan turned onto a narrow, tree-lined street where the streetlights were flickering and far apart. The houses here were old, with deep porches and overgrown lawns that acted as barriers between neighbors. Bacardi slowed the SUV, dousing the headlights while still rolling forward. The hunt was nearing its end. Dante settled back into the leather seat, his face illuminated by the pale blue light of the digital trail. The data was clear, the target was acquired, and the Romanio family was about to bring the shadows of the city down on Robert Vance. The silver sedan pulled into the gravel driveway of a 2-story house that looked as though it were trying to retreat into the surrounding woods. From the street, it was a picture of suburban isolation, but as Dante watched through a pair of high-powered binoculars, he saw the architectural signatures of a tomb. The windows on the ground floor had been reinforced from the inside, and the heavy oak door featured a deadbolt system that required a key even to exit. It was a concrete prison disguised as a quiet home, a place where the outside world was systematically blocked out so that a private hell could flourish. Bacardi tapped on his tablet, his face lit by the harsh glow of the screen. It's not just a house, Dante. It's a recurring set piece. Vance has leased similar properties in 3 different counties over the last 5 years. He targets houses with deep basements and no immediate neighbors. He swiped a finger across the glass, revealing a hidden layer of Bobby's history that had been buried under aliases and offshore accounts. He's a failed medical student who specialized in trauma. He knows exactly how to break a body without leaving a trace that a standard ER would catch. He's not just an abuser, he's an engineer of pain. Dante watched as Bobby stepped out of the car, rounding the hood to open Cassandra's door. He didn't offer his hand to help her. He grabbed her upper arm, his fingers sinking into the fabric of her hoodie. Cassandra stumbled slightly, her neck brace limiting her peripheral vision, making her world narrow and terrifying. Bobby leaned in close to her ear, his posture mimicry of a loving husband. But the way Cassandra's entire body went rigid told a different story. "He's moving her in," Dante said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "He thinks once that door closes, he's the only god she has to answer to." Through the lens, Dante saw the moment the heavy door shut behind them. The porch light flickered once and then died, leaving the front of the house in total darkness. Bacardi's digital intercept picked up the activation of a high-end security system, one designed to keep things in just as much as it kept things out. Bobby Vance had spent years perfecting this ritual, selecting his victims, isolating them, and then vanishing into the cracks of the suburban landscape. He believed his meticulous planning made him untouchable. He didn't realize that the shadows he used for cover were the very place where Dante Romanio held absolute dominion. The hunt was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The silence of the Queen's Street was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of a city that didn't know a monster was hiding in its suburbs. Dante didn't believe in shouting or dramatic entrances. He believed in the surgical precision of an inevitable consequence. Bacardi moved with the grace of a ghost, his hand hovering over a device that bypassed the electronic deadbolt in seconds. With a soft, mechanical click that sounded like a final judgment, the heavy oak door swung open. The air inside the house smelled of antiseptic and unwashed laundry, a sterile mask over the scent of stagnant fear. They moved through the foyer without a sound, their footsteps swallowed by the thick carpet Bobby had likely installed to dampen the noise of a struggle. From the back of the house, the low murmur of Bobby's voice drifted through the hallway, a calm, conversational tone that was more chilling than any scream. It was the sound of a man who believed his dominion was absolute. Dante stepped into the doorway of the kitchen. Bobby was standing over Cassandra, who was seated at a small table, her hands trembling as she tried to lift a glass of water. Her neck brace forced her chin up, making her look like a sacrificial offering. Bobby had his back to the door, his hand resting on the back of her chair, his posture relaxed and proprietary. "You missed a spot with the concealer, Cassandra," Bobby said, his voice dripping with a fake, oily concern. "People might get the wrong idea. And we can't have that, can we?" Dante leaned against the doorframe, his shadow stretching long across the linoleum floor. "I think the wrong idea is exactly what people have been getting for years, Robert." Bobby spun around, the glass in his hand shattering on the floor as his trustworthy mask disintegrated. His face went pale, his eyes darting toward the knife block on the counter. But he froze when he saw Bacardi standing behind Dante, a silent mountain of a man with eyes like flint. Cassandra didn't scream. She didn't move. She simply looked at Dante, and for the first time, the hollow stare was replaced by a flicker of disbelief. "Who the hell are you?" Bobby stammered, his voice rising into a thin, desperate pitch. "This is private property. I'll call the police." Dante took a slow, deliberate step into the room, his presence filling the space until the air felt heavy and thin. "Go ahead. Call them. I've brought along a few things they'd be very interested to see. Financial records, lease agreements for basement renovations, and a very detailed medical history you thought you'd buried in Illinois." He paused, his gaze dropping to the trembling girl. But we aren't here for the police, Robert. We're here to discuss a change in management. Dante didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The air in the cramped kitchen seemed to solidify, thick with the scent of copper and the sudden, sharp ozone of Bobby's panic. Bobby tried to maintain his upright posture, but his knees had begun a subtle, betraying tremor. He looked at Bacardi, then back to Dante's cold, unblinking eyes, and he saw a reality he couldn't manipulate. This wasn't a neighbor or a social worker. This was a man who understood the mechanics of the abyss far better than he did. "You're a man of details, Robert," Dante said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "So let's discuss the details of your retirement. You're going to sit at that table, and you're going to sign every document Bacardi places in front of you. You're signing over the lease to this house. You're signing over the title to that silver sedan. You're signing a full confession of the events in Illinois, Ohio, and New York." Bobby's face contorted, the mask of the protector finally sliding off to reveal the jagged, desperate ego underneath. "You can't do this. I've done nothing wrong." "She fell. She's clumsy." Dante moved then, a blur of motion that ended with his hand wrapped around Bobby's throat, pinning him against the refrigerator with enough force to rattle the magnets. The sound of Bobby's breath hitching in his throat was the only noise in the room. Dante leaned in, his lips inches from the man's ear. "I have seen men like you in every corner of the world. You think you're a god because you can break a girl who is already hurting. But in my world, you're just a parasite. And I've spent my life removing parasites." He let go, and Bobby slumped to the floor, coughing and gasping, his pride leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. Bacardi placed a stack of papers and a pen on the table. With a single, terrified glance at the exit, blocked by Bacardi's massive frame, Bobby reached for the pen. His hand shook so violently that the first signature was nearly illegible, but he didn't stop. He signed away his money, his freedom, and his power. Dante turned to Cassandra. She was watching the man who had been her son and her shadow collapse into a pathetic heap. Dante reached into his pocket and pulled out a burner phone and a set of keys to a safe house in Vermont. He placed them on the table in front of her. "The car is outside. The driver will take you wherever you want to go, but my advice is to go where he can't find you. By tomorrow morning, Robert Vance will not exist in any database in this country. He will be a ghost, monitored by people who are much less patient than I am." Cassandra looked at the keys, then up at Dante. For the first time, her hands stopped shaking. She stood up, her movements still stiff from the brace, but her eyes were clear. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. The debt to Elena was paid, and the silent signal had finally been answered with a roar. 3 years passed before the echoes of that afternoon at Gate 14 returned to Dante in a tangible form. He was in his study in New York, the fireplace casting long, flickering shadows against the mahogany walls, when a thick cream envelope appeared on his desk. It bore a postmark from a small town in Vermont and contained no return address. Inside was a single photograph and a short note. The photo showed a woman standing on the peak of a mountain, her face turned toward the sun, her neck bare and free of the plastic cage that had once defined her. There were no bruises, only the sharp, clear lines of a woman who had reclaimed her own skin. The note read, "I am no longer sitting perfectly still. I am moving. Thank you for paying attention." Dante didn't reply. He was a man who operated in the quiet of the night, and his intervention was never meant to be a beginning for him, only an ending for the man who had tried to break her. He placed the note in a secure drawer alongside the few ghosts he allowed himself to remember, and he went back to the business of his empire. 6 months later, a business trip took him to Boston. While walking through the historic halls of a downtown athletic center, he stopped near a set of double glass doors. Inside, a group of women were gathered in a circle, their movements fluid and powerful. At the center was Cassandra. She was leaner now, her hair cut short, her eyes no longer hollow but filled with a fierce, grounding light. She was demonstrating a defensive maneuver, showing a young girl how to turn a predator's momentum against him. Dante stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching as she commanded the room. She was no longer a victim. She was a self-defense instructor, a woman who had turned her trauma into a shield for others. When the session ended, her eyes drifted toward the hallway. She saw him, the dark suit, the faint facial scar, the man who had seen a finger gun signal and chose to act. She walked toward the door, stopping just inches from the glass. She didn't offer a signal of distress this time. Instead, she raised her hand and gave a small, firm nod of recognition. It was a silent conversation between two people who lived in a world where words were often used to lie, but actions were the only currency that mattered. "I still teach it," she said, her voice clear and carrying through the cracked door. "The signal. I tell them that the world is full of people who look away, but it only takes one person who chooses to see." Dante looked at her, seeing the woman she had become, a living testament to a trajectory changed. "The world needs people who are brave enough to ask for help," he replied quietly. She smiled, a real, transformative expression that reached her eyes. "And people who are dangerous enough to give it." She turned back to her class, her movements confident and free. Dante walked away into the Boston crowd, his head held high. He couldn't save everyone, and he couldn't undo the past. But as he moved through the sea of strangers, he kept his eyes open, ever vigilant for the next silent signal in a world that finally felt a little less dark. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.